I used to think my father's hands were the safest place in the world. They were calloused, strong, and smelled of cedar and old money. Oscar Thorne was a man who didn't just walk into a room, he owned the air inside it. My mother, Grace, was the opposite, a soft, fading watercolor of a woman who lived in the shadows he cast. We were the perfect family, the kind people envied. But the truth about a shadow is that it only exists because something is blocking the light. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary day that has no business ruining a life. I was 24, preparing for a routine surgery, when the doctor walked into my hospital room. He looked at my chart, then at my father, then back at me. He had this look on his face, the look of a man who had found a glitch in the universe. He told us that my blood type was O negative. He said it was scientifically impossible for two parents with AB positive blood to have a child like me. The room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. My father didn't flinch. He just stood there, his jaw set like a trap. But my mother? Grace made a sound that I will never forget. A soft, strangled gasp, like a bird being crushed in a fist. "Check the tests again," my father said. His voice wasn't a question, it was a command. He sounded like he was talking to a disobedient employee, not a doctor. But the doctor didn't back down. He talked about genetics, about alleles, about facts. And that was the first time I saw the mask slip. My father's eyes didn't show confusion, they showed a cold, calculating fury. When we got home, the house felt different. The high ceilings felt like they were pressing down on me. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the woman I called my mother. Her hands were shaking as she poured tea. "Who am I, Mom?" I asked. The words felt like glass in my mouth. Grace wouldn't look at me. She just kept pouring until the tea spilled over the rim of the cup, staining the white marble counter like a dark bruise. "You're our daughter, Daizy," she whispered. "That's all that matters." "It's not all that matters," I screamed. "I'm a medical impossibility. Did you adopt me? Is that why you never showed me my baby pictures from the hospital?" My father walked into the room then. He didn't scream. He never screamed. He just sat down at the head of the table and looked at me with that terrifyingly calm expression. "Daizy," he said, "I took a seed from the mud and planted it in a palace. I gave you a name that carries weight. I gave you a life that people kill for. Do not let your curiosity destroy your comfort." It wasn't a denial, it was a threat. I want you to stop right now and think. If your father told you that your life was a gift he stole for you, would you take the comfort or the truth? Hit the subscribe button and tell me in the comments, what's the biggest secret you've ever uncovered in your family? Now, let's get into the hunt. I didn't listen to him. I couldn't. For the next 2 weeks, I became a ghost in my own home. I watched them. I realized that my father didn't just have a home office, he had a fortress. He had a safe in the floorboards under his desk that he never left unlocked. But every man has a weakness, and my father's weakness was his pride. He thought I was too broken by the news to be a threat. I waited until he left for a week-long investors retreat in London. I waited until my mother had taken her nightly nerve tonic, the heavy sedatives my father insisted she take. I used a borescope camera I'd bought online to peek at the tumbler of his safe. It took me 3 nights of shivering in the dark, but I finally heard the click. I expected to find a birth certificate, maybe a confession note. What I found was a leather-bound surveillance ledger. It was a horror story in 300 pages. My father hadn't just found a baby, he had hunted one. Inside the ledger were hundreds of photos of a woman. They spanned 24 years. Photos of her at a grocery store in a tiny coastal village called Blackwood. Photos of her standing by a grave that had no name. Photos of her crying on a park bench. My father had been paying private investigators to follow the woman he had stolen me from for my entire life. He had been watching her grieve, watching her search, and probably enjoying every second of it. In the back of the ledger was a newspaper clipping from July 1999. Mother claims infant stolen during flood rescue. Authorities rule it a tragic accident. The report said a volunteer in a yellow slicker had offered to carry the baby to the high ground boat while the mother went back for her elderly neighbor. When the mother reached the boat, the volunteer and the baby were gone. The police told her the boat must have capsized in the rapids. They told her she was hysterical. They told her there was no volunteer fitting that description. I looked at the photos of the woman in the ledger. Her name was Anika. She had my eyes. She had my chin. And, according to the last entry in the ledger, dated only a week ago, she was still living in that same coastal village, still working at a small bakery, still waiting for a ghost to come home. I didn't pack a bag. I just grabbed the ledger, the silver bird blanket I'd found hidden in the safe, and my car keys. I drove 6 hours through a thunderstorm that felt like the world was weeping with me. I found the bakery. It was a small, salt-crusted building at the edge of the Atlantic. When I walked in, the bell above the door chimed and a woman turned around from the oven. She looked at me and I felt a physical shock, like an electric current hitting my heart. It wasn't just that we looked alike, it was the energy, the shared soul. Anika looked at me and her eyes went wide. She didn't ask if I wanted bread, she didn't ask my name, she just whispered, "July?" I held out the wool blanket. The silver bird was frayed, the thread dull after 20 years, but the moment she saw it, she collapsed. I caught her before she hit the floor. We sat there on the flour-dusted boards, two strangers who were more than family, and she told me the story. "He had a scar," she whispered, her hands shaking as she touched my face. "The man in the yellow coat, he had a jagged scar across his thumb. He looked so kind, Daizy. He looked like a savior. I handed you to him because I trusted him. I spent 20 years thinking I was the one who killed you. I spent 20 years in therapy, in hospitals, because everyone told me I'd imagined the man. They told me I'd dropped you in the water, and my brain had invented a monster to protect me." I felt a cold, sharp rage settle in my bones. My father hadn't just stolen me, he had gaslit a woman into insanity to cover his tracks. He had used his power and his money to make sure the police never looked for the volunteer. "He's here, Anika," I said. She froze. "Who?" "The man who took me. He's my father, or he's the man who raised me." And then the bell above the door chimed again. I didn't even have to turn around. I knew the weight of those footsteps. I knew the smell of that expensive cologne. My father walked in, looking perfectly composed in a charcoal overcoat. He looked at the bakery, at the flour on the floor, at the woman he had stalked for a quarter of a century. "I have a GPS tracker on your car, Daizy," he said, his voice as smooth as silk. "I told you not to let your curiosity destroy you. Now you've brought me to this pathetic place." Anika stood up. She was half his size, but in that moment she looked like a giant. "You," she breathed. "I saw your face every night in my nightmares." Oscar Thorne smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow thing. And yet here I am, a pillar of the community, a philanthropist. And what are you? A broken woman in a dying village. I took her because she deserved a father who could provide, not a mother who lived in a shack. "You stole her," Anika screamed. "I improved her," my father countered. He looked at me, his eyes hard as flint. "Daizy, get in the car. We're going to tell the police that this woman kidnapped you today. We're going to tell them she's obsessed, that she's a stalker. With my lawyers, she'll be in a psych ward by morning. Come now, choose your life." I looked at him. I thought about the treehouse. I thought about the college tuition. I thought about the 24 years of love. And then I thought about the ledger. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Oscar," I said. "Don't be a fool," he snapped. "You think the truth matters? The truth is what I say it is. I have the records, I have the power." "You had the ledger," I said, pulling it from my coat, "but I have the digital copies. I sent them to the state prosecutor 3 hours ago. I sent the surveillance photos. I sent the logs of the payments you made to the volunteers in 1999 to stay quiet. I even sent the forensic report on your thumb scar. For the first time in my life, I saw Oscar Thorne look afraid. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking old and gray. "You'd destroy everything for her?" he whispered. "After everything I gave you?" "You didn't give me anything," I said. "You just loaned it to me, and the interest was my mother's soul." The sound of sirens began to howl in the distance, echoing off the coastal cliffs. My father looked at the door, then back at me. He realized the palace was crumbling. He realized that the seed he had planted in his palace had grown into the tree that was going to tear the walls down. When the police arrived, they didn't find a pillar of the community. They found a man who had spent 24 years building a cage and calling it a home. The trial was a circus. The masala the papers loved was the fact that my mother, Grace, was the star witness. She had kept her own secret ledger, a diary of every time Oscar had threatened her, every time he had mentioned the coastal woman. She had been a prisoner too. Oscar is in a maximum security prison now. He'll never touch cedar or old money again. Grace lives in a quiet cottage 3 miles up the coast from us. She's learning how to live without a sedative in her hand. But I have one question in my mind. That is, why? I spent months sitting across from him in that glass-walled visitation room at the prison. I didn't go because I loved him. I went because a hole in your life doesn't close until you know exactly how it was dug. He sat there, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look like parchment. He still carried himself like a king, even in a room that smelled of floor wax and regret. I pushed the recording of the trial toward him and asked the only question that mattered. Why her? Why Annika? There were thousands of orphans in the world, Oscar. You had the money to adopt 10 children legally. Why did you have to destroy a woman's mind to get me? He said. His voice was a dry rattle, but his eyes were sharp. You think this was about a child, Daizy? You think I just wanted a daughter to play catch with? You're smarter than that. He leaned into the glass, his breath fogging the surface. He told me about the winter of '98. Before I was born, Oscar had been the CEO of a massive land development firm. He had made a mistake, a $1 billion miscalculation on a dam project that was going to flood the very valley where Annika lived. He said, "The flood wasn't just an act of God, Daizy. It was an act of engineering. My firm knew the levees would break. I knew that village was going to be wiped off the map. I went there that night as a volunteer, not to save people, but to destroy evidence. I needed to make sure certain documents in the local government office were washed away forever. And you found a baby instead?" He said, "I found Annika. She was standing in the rain, holding you, looking like the very conscience I had spent my life trying to kill. She represented everything I was about to destroy. In that moment, I realized that if I took you, I could fix the debt. I could save the one thing that mattered from the ruins I had created. It wasn't love, Daizy. It was an offset. I thought if I gave the daughter of the valley a life of luxury, the universe would forgive me for drowning the rest of her people." My blood turned to ice. He hadn't stolen me to be a father. He had stolen me as a trophy of his own mercy. He wanted to look at me every day and remind himself that he wasn't a monster because he had saved one person from the disaster he had engineered. He said, "And Annika? I couldn't let her find you. If she found you, she'd find out why the flood really happened. She'd find out the dam was built with cheap concrete. I had to keep her broken. I had to keep her insane, because a grieving, crazy woman is never a credible witness in a court of law. I didn't stalk her because I was obsessed with her, Daizy. I monitored her because she was a loose end. So every birthday, every gift, every I love you, it was all just you balancing a ledger?" He said. He tapped the glass with his scarred thumb. "It was the most expensive project of my life, and you were the only part of it that worked, until you didn't." I stood up. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a profound, soul-deep disgust. He wasn't a man. He was a machine that had malfunctioned and convinced itself it had a heart. You didn't save me from the flood, Oscar. You were the flood. And the only thing you didn't account for was that water always finds its level. I walked out of that prison and never looked back. I went back to the coast, to the village that was slowly rebuilding. I told Annika the truth about the dam, about the why. We didn't use the Thorne millions to fix it. We used the settlement from the class action lawsuit I helped her file against his estate. We didn't just find a daughter and a mother, we found justice for a whole valley that a man thought he could buy with a silver bird blanket and a 24-year lie. The harvest is over, the land is resting, and finally, the water is clear. If you think the truth is worth more than $1 billion, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories of people who burn down their lives to find their souls. I'm Daisy, and I'll see you in the next one.